Um, as promised, we will catch up a little bit on the end of Mad Love before we go into Benjamin's Surrealism essay and related writings, including his own sort of surrealistic writings on Marseilles. Sorry. So this is just, I was reminding myself of the table of contents of the edition of Illuminations that Adorno edited, curated, as opposed to the one that we're using. And I was looking to see if the Surrealism essay was there, but it's not. I thought that it was, because a lot of what's in Reflections and not Illuminations is in the Adorno version of Illuminations. But not the Surrealism essay. For some reason, I misremembered that, because we'll see that the Surrealism essay is quite important, especially when we're considering how things are kind of adding up in the course, how our readings are accumulating. All right, so next week we're off for Thanksgiving. When we come back, okay, let's talk about this. When we come back, we have Critique Week, and I know you guys are grad students. However, I'm going to hold class as an optional session Critique Week because I requested that my critique panel be on another day, on Wednesday. So I'm going to hold this class, and we're going to see what we might need to. So how many of you guys could come? Monday, after Thanksgiving, Critique Week. So most everybody. All right, so what I usually, because we have a very heavy week of readings on the 8th, and so what usually has happened, we have a slightly different schedule this semester. Often Critique Week is after the readings that we do for the 8th. And so this set of readings can bear being broken up into two parts. So that's how I usually utilize the Critique Week to discuss half the readings for that week. And the way it breaks down is we have Nietzsche on the use and abuse of history for life, which is a kind of work in and of itself. And then we have the Paris exposés, namely his kind of funding proposal for the Arcades project. So we have two versions. We have 1935, the initial version, and then we have a revised version from 1939. So those usually demand their own attention. And the Nietzsche and the conversations with Brecht and the whole question of the 19th and 20th century with Baudelaire and Brecht sort of bear their own session. So we would start Critique Week with the Nietzsche and the conversations with Brecht and that material, and then on the 8th we'll do, in the subsequent week we will concentrate on the Paris exposés. The funding proposal for the Arcades project, the two versions, and the related Convolute D from the Arcades project. So hopefully this will be useful for you guys to hold the extra class session. I'll send an announcement about that, reminding you guys that we'll be meeting on the 1st, but that's how we'll parse things out. Okay. So, okay, and we have some notes from you guys that I also want to return to that. We did not get a chance to discuss last week. And who were my exactly where my notes from last time, so we didn't necessarily think good. And so we'll see. Oops. Okay, let me bring up our reflections. So, towards the end of Breton's Mad Love, yeah, let's look at just the last section here. So we talked a little bit about the historical moment that he's writing in. So 1937, it's after the Spanish Civil War, and it's in the context of World War II having broken out. And also we will see when we read Conversations with Brecht, it's after the purge trials have taken place in the Soviet Union. So anyway, Dear Hazel of Squirrel Nut, in the lovely springtime of 1952, you will be just 16, and perhaps you will be tempted to open this book, whose title, I like to think, will be wafted to you euphonically by the wind bending the hawthorns. All possible dreams, hopes, and illusions will dance, I hope night and day, illuminated by your pearls, and I shall doubtless be there no longer. I would have liked to be there just to see you. Mysterious, resplendent horsemen will dash by at dusk beside the changeable streams. Garbed in light sea-green veils, a young girl will glide sleepwalking under high archways where a single votive lamp will flicker. But the spirits of the reeds, the tiny cat seeming to sleep in the rings, the elegant toy pistol perforated with the word ball, will keep you from taking these scenes tragically. Whatever your lot will be, increasingly fortunate or entirely other, I cannot know. You will delight in living, expecting everything from love. Whatever happens from now until you read this letter, it seems that what we least expect is what will come to pass. Let me believe you will be ready then to incarnate this eternal power of woman, the only power I have ever submitted to. Whether you have just closed a school desk on a world crow blue in high fantasy, or whether your sunny silhouette, except for the bouquet of flowers on your blouse, is cast against the wall of a factory, I am far from sure about your future. Let me believe that these words, mad love, will one day correspond uniquely to your own delirium. They will not keep their promise because they will only enlighten for you the mystery of your birth. For a long time I thought it was the gravest insanity to give life. In any case, I held it against those who had given it to me. It may be that you would hold it against me on some days. Do you remember the Kafka, the filial piety and ancestral guilt, the motif, right? And I think we talked about it at the time. I pointed out to you guys that you owe your parents nothing, whereas they owe you everything because they inflicted life on you. Meaning they're responsible for all your suffering. So, that is in fact why I've chosen to see you at 16, when you cannot hold it against me. What am I saying? To look at you, no, rather to try to see through your eyes, to look at myself through your eyes. My little child, just 8 months old, always smiling, made at once like coral and like pearls. You will know then that any element of chance was strictly excluded from your coming, that your birth came about at the exact time it was supposed to, neither sooner nor later, and then no shadow was awaiting you above your wicker cradle. Even that great poverty, which had been and remains mine, let up for a few days. I was not, as it happens, opposed to this poverty. I accepted to pay the price for not being a slave to life, to settle for the right I had assumed once and for all to not express any ideas but my own. We were not many in doing this. Poverty passed by in the distance, made lovelier and almost justified, a little like what has been called, in the case of a painter who was one of your first friends, the Blue Period. That's Picasso. It seemed the almost inevitable consequence of my refusal to behave the way almost all the others did, whether on one side or the other. This poverty, whether you have had the time to dread it or not, imagine it was only the other side of the miraculous coin of your existence. The night of the sunflower would have been less radiant without it. Jump ahead here. At least that will have been permanently my great hope, undiminished by my not always being able to show myself worthy. If it ever mingles with another hope, I am sure this latter is just as important for you. I have wanted your existence to know for itself this raison d'etre, reason for being, that I had asked it of what was for me beauty, in all the fullest strength of the term, love, in all the strength of the term. The name that I give you at the top of this letter does not just render, in its anagrammatical form, a charming account of your present aspect, because after having invented it for you, I perceived that I had originally used the words that make it up to characterize the very aspect that love had taken for me. This must be what resemblance is. I also wanted everything that I expect from human becoming, everything that, as I see it, is worth fighting for collectively and not just individually. To cease being a formal manner of thinking, even the noblest, to confront this reality of life becoming that you are. I mean that at one time in my life I feared being cut off from the necessary contact, from the human contact with what would be after me. After me. This idea keeps getting lost, but turns up again wonderfully in a certain sleight of hand that you have, like, and for me not like, all little children. From the very first day I admired your hand. It hovered about everything intellectual I had tried to construct, as if to render it inane. What a mad thing this hand is, and how I pity those who have never had the chance to place it like a star on the loveliest page of a book. The poverty suddenly of any flower. We only have to look at this hand to think that any human makes a deplorable account of what he thinks he knows. All he understands from it is that it is really made, in all senses, for the best. This blind aspiration towards the best would suffice to justify love as I think of it, absolute love, as the only principle for physical and moral selection, which can guarantee that human witness, human passage, shall not have taken place in vain. I was thinking of all this feverishly in September 1936, alone with you in my famous unlivable house of rock salt. I was thinking about it between reading newspapers, telling more or less hypocritically the episodes of the Civil War in Spain. The newspapers behind which you thought I was disappearing, just to play peekaboo with you. It was also true because in such moments, the unconscious and the conscious, in you and in me, existed in complete duality near each other, keeping each other in total ignorance and yet communicating at will by a single all-powerful thread, which was the exchanged glance between us. To be sure, my life then hung only by the slightest thread. Great was the temptation to go offer it to those who, without any possible error and any distinction of tendencies, wanted at any price to finish with the old order, founded on the cult of that abject trinity, family, country, and religion. By the way, that's in the Vichy France, the Vichy Republic that was allied with the Nazis, they replaced liberty, equality, and fraternity with maybe a slight variation of that. It wasn't, it was, I think it's work, country, and faith. Yeah. And still you held me by that thread which is happiness, such as it pierces the web of unhappiness itself. I loved in you all the little children of the Spanish militia, like those I had seen running naked in the outer district of Santa Cruz on Tenerife. May the sacrifice of so many human lives make of them one day happy beings. And yet I did not feel in myself the courage to expose you with me to help that to happen. Above all, let the idea of the family be buried. Let's have a picture here. The Spanish Civil War. Let the idea of the family be buried. If I have loved in you the working out of a natural necessity, it is to the exact extent that in your person it was one with what was for me human necessity, logical necessity. The reconciliation of these two necessities has always seemed to me the only miracle within the reach of any human, the only chance of escaping now and then the meanness of the human condition. Nature and freedom, to use some Kantian language. You have gone from non-being to being by one of these agreements, which are the only ones to which I care to listen. You were thought of as possible, as certain, in the very moment when, in a love deeply sure of itself, a man and a woman wanted you to be. I wanted you too much to hear you one day answering in complete innocence those insidious questions grown-ups ask children. What do we think with, suffer with? How did we get the sun's name? Where does the night come from? As if they could answer the questions themselves. Since you are for me the human creature, in its perfect authenticity, you should, improbable as it seems, teach me about them. I want you to be madly loved. So she's the found object. She's the found object. All right, so we've encountered with Baudelaire via Benjamin. Here it is the commodity itself that speaks. But that's not just dehumanization, that's also humanization. Right? The meaning of chance and necessity. The meeting of irrationality and reason. Right, that's also the Freudian part. I don't know whether we've gotten into very much in his discussion. I told you that there's the Hegelian part of the theoretical discourse in Mad Love, there's the Marxist part, and there's the Freudian part. So that's something that is, in one respect, just a chance accident, just a random occurrence, becomes necessary after the fact, because it becomes part of what exists. Right, so there's, I think all the way back to Kant, when we talked about the dialectic of being and becoming, what is and what ought to be, nature and freedom, nature and spirit. Right, so biological reproduction is just the working out of nature. It's sort of haunted by this question of, with what right in our freedom do we choose, or do we not have the choice to fulfill that natural necessity that as human beings, right, in our humanity? So he says something that I'm sure resonates with a lot of people, which is that he didn't want to do it. He didn't want to biologically reproduce. Right, but then he was glad that he did. Right, so what might have been an accident became intentional in retrospect. and became an act of freedom, even if it is the playing out of a natural necessity. Jack, is there anything you want to bring up from last week?
Not that I remember super well.
Oh, yeah.
But
the onrush of time.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know, I have to like reread these questions literally. But
you know what we could do also? We could return to anything that you feel like we didn't get to talk about last week as they become relevant in light of the surrealism essay we wrote for this week. Does that seem fair?
Yeah.
All right, why don't we do that? Because some of the same themes and concerns are present, and so that might be more motivated rather than trying to artificially reproduce what you guys were thinking last week.
I actually have a place to start.
Okay.
On that note.
Yeah. Great.
At the bottom, starting at the bottom paragraph of 181 of the Surrealism essay, he starts talking about objects that have become these extinct objects that have become fascination for. Yeah, in that paragraph. I was interested. It starts
The
with
top paragraph or the bottom one?
The bottom paragraph.
The bottom one, yeah.
In the middle of it, he says the objects that have begun to be extinct, and then he continues through the paragraph on the next page. And I was interested in that kind of continuing the discussion of objects with like Breton.
All right, so let's talk about this, because this is a point of contact. So I think that we talked about the courtly romance, right? The poetry of courtly romance. So we're talking about aristocrats in the Middle Ages and aristocratic culture as it carries over into the bourgeois era, and how there are three love objects, right? There's the object of filial love, which is the wife and the children and the parents, the relatives, but the wife, right, or the husband. There's that object, the marriage partner, but that's more of a political alliance. It's more of a function of duty. It's the person that you're going to have children with, because that's part of what it's about. That's why it's the filial love. Then, of course, there are the erotic love objects. There are the mistresses, and there are the affairs, which are expected, right? That people would have sex with people other than who they were married to. Like, we take a lot of bourgeois puritanism for granted and project it onto the past. It was not there. It was definitely not there. And then finally, there's the lady of esoteric love. In other words, there were the people that you'd write poetry to who would not be your marriage partner nor your sexual partner. Right, so there would be this kind of ideal love object that is not fulfilled in any respect, physically or socially, politically, which is, of course, what marriage is about. It's about society and politics. Whereas sex, erotic, sexual love is not necessarily about that. And then there's this other kind of love object. Right, that's why he says the lady in esoteric love matters least. So what's that about? Well, in other words, it speaks to the issue of what kind of object. And it gets to Benjamin's criticism of the surrealists, which we read Mad Love first in the course in order to get a taste of a more mature, reflective narcissism on the part of Breton, as opposed to the more unreflected kind of enacting narcissism of the early surrealists and of Naja. Right, so in other words, when you're writing courtly romance poetry to, the object of this kind of affection, what matters is not the object. What matters is your feeling. And so in some ways it's most purely visible there as opposed to filial love, marriage, and sexual love. Right, so so the lady in esoteric love matters least, so too for Breton. He is closer to the things that Naja is close to than to her. Okay, so that complicates things a bit. Meaning, we know the techniques of surrealism, like bricolage and the exquisite corpse, automatism, right? But basically, it's about juxtapositions and associations, right? And this is why Freud becomes important for them, because of dream symbolism as a model. So, in other words, it's not really Naja who's the object. It's more what he associates with her, as well as his own feelings about those associations. So it's kind of a complex schema that he's setting up here, but we encountered it a bit already with the correspondences, with the Baudelairean correspondences. Right. Okay, what are these things? Nothing could reveal more about surrealism than their canon. In other words, their kind of series of objects. Where shall I begin? He can boast an extraordinary discovery. He was the first to perceive the revolutionary energies that appear in the outmoded. Okay, so this goes to the second hand, the found object, as something that is having a second life. So it's dropped out of circulation as a commodity, it's dropped out of its original use value and its original exchange value.
Okay.
And because of that, it tends to have a temporal, like, displacement or lag character to it, meaning that by the time things are getting their second life on the sort of secondary market, then they're no longer in fashion. They're outmoded. By the way, mode. So modern means now. Mode means current. Right, fashionable. Right, so there is always that question of modernity and fashion, we'll see. So the outmoded, the unfashionable. In the first iron constructions, the first factory buildings, the earliest photos, the objects that have begun to be extinct, grand pianos, the dresses of 5 years ago, fashionable restaurants when the vogue has begun to ebb from them. The relation of these things to revolution. No one can have a more exact concept of it than these authors. So again, the revolutionary energy is in the outmoded. So what is that? It's the unfulfilled potential of the outmoded, meaning things fulfilled their potential in capitalism first time around, meaning they had their use value, they had their exchange value, they fulfilled that value that they had as commodities. Redeeming, however, the question of redemption, what about redeeming the value of their unfulfilled potential? What about redeeming the value that was not realized in their original production and consumption as commodities, in their original use value and exchange value? But that's the revolutionary energy. So the revolutionary energy of capitalism is not how it is, but how it ought to be, but is not. It's in its potential and possibility, not in its extant reality. Super important, because of course the vulgar Marxists get that all screwed up. Right? And then they're left wondering whether the revolutionary energy comes from human labor power or comes from technology. Where does it come from? No, it doesn't come from either of those things. It comes from the unfulfilled potential that's expressed by the contradiction of these things. No one before these visionaries and augurs perceived how destitution, not only social but architectonic, and poverty of interiors, enslaved and enslaving objects, that's a great Baudelairean expression right there, can be suddenly transformed into revolutionary nihilism. So we've done the theologico-political fragment, the task of world politics, whose method must be called nihilism. All right, so that doesn't mean a simple endorsement. Right, so we're going to be doing Nietzsche when we next meet. And Nietzsche is usually called a nihilist philosopher. No. He's a philosopher of nihilism, meaning he wants to know the meaning of nihilism. We did talk about all that exists deserves to perish, Engels? Maybe not. All right. Let's bring it in here. I thought that we did the theological political fragment. What do we got? Go ahead.
What is like the historical root of nihilism if not the late 19th century? Where is it?
Well, okay, so obviously nihilism is an ancient problem that philosophers tried to deal with, and also you could say not just philosophers, but religion tried to deal with. So, you know, religion tries to overcome the inherent nihilism of human existence. Right? So we don't talk about this when we do Nietzsche next time, but we don't live the way the animals do. Meaning the animals don't face the problem of nihilism, nor do they demand the redemption for their existence. So the fact that we demand the redemption for our existence and that we face nihilism, inseparable. That's an inseparable issue. So as soon as humans became cultural as opposed to natural, we have faced the question of nihilism. And we answered it with religion. And that did us well for tens of thousands of years until the modern era. And then it still wasn't really a problem until the capitalist era. Right, so the bourgeois era is not equivalent to atheism or secularism per se. It's a transformation of the religious. The reason I bring all this up is that Benjamin is going to be criticizing the Surrealists for their undigested religiosity, right? And yet he also wants to find the meaning in it and redeem it, if you will, but challenge their self-understanding of it. Nihilism has a long history, but it has a recent history. And the recent history is really the capitalist era. And I'll just point out that, since we're in France with Baudelaire and the Surrealists, and since the whole point of Benjamin's essay is considered France, because he's writing to the German audience. Durkheim, Emile Durkheim, who's one of the founders of modern sociology in the late 19th century, his first work is on suicide. And I think that we dealt with this a little bit with Baudelaire when Baudelaire says, where is the modern suicide? We have the ancient suicide, which is heroic, but where's the modern corollary of that? And because suicide used to be a ruling class thing, meaning suicide was something that priests and aristocrats did to preserve their values, to preserve the meaning of their existence, rather than have it be, lost or defiled or profaned in some way. Death before dishonor. Modern society is different. In modern society, ruling class people and subaltern people, poor people, working class people commit suicide out of the meaninglessness of their existence. And it doesn't preserve the meaning of their existence. It doesn't help save the value of their existence. It doesn't redeem their existence the way ancient suicide did. But rather seems to put the seal on, like the imprimatur, it seems to be an expression of the meaninglessness. Right? And Durkheim's whole sociology is structured around dealing with the problem of what you call anomie, meaning that we were living without rules or laws. An anomic society, and he considered that to be what he called the pathology of transition. Meaning, he said, modern society is not without values, it has its values, but it's caught between old values and new values that aren't fully formed. And so because we're in this transition, it can seem like just a loss of values. But in fact, what we're doing is figuring out the new values. So, in other words, the meaning of nihilism. And by the way, he's a contemporary of, well, not really, he's a little bit younger, kind of a rough contemporary of Nietzsche, because Nietzsche died young, relatively young. Nietzsche also thought that the nihilism of modernity was a pathology of transition, meaning he called it a pregnancy the way an illness, the way pregnancy is an illness. So it's an illness, but the way pregnancy is an illness. Meaning that the point is not to cure it, but undergo it successfully to bring forth new life. Not to eliminate it, but to suffer through it in the name of new life. Meaning that's the whole Overman, the whole notorious Superman, Overman of Nietzsche, is that he thought that the pathology of modernity, what Benjamin as a Marxist would consider to be capitalism, to be the threshold of something completely new, beyond it. That's the Overman. Or it might get stuck in the condition of the last man, which is of course what we've done. Right, so, but the idea being, and this is again where Nietzsche and Marx and Engels and the Marxists would agree, is that we're on the threshold of a transformation of our humanity unlike any other ever in history. So it goes way beyond the bourgeois emancipation from traditional civilization. It goes beyond the agricultural revolution. It might even go beyond the human revolution itself. It might go beyond the transition from nature to culture of the human revolution itself. And that's why it's haunted by fundamental questions of humanity, etc., nature, freedom. Yeah. And, so everything that we are horrified by around us is a symptom of the great transition that we are tasked with fulfilling, but we have not yet. So what's the symptom of that? Nihilism. Okay, so obviously that means the surrealists are bearing a great deal of weight on their shoulders for a little bohemian, wacky, narcissistic art movement. So any random bohos, might actually be expressing the burden of our transition to a higher form of life, unbeknownst to them. But hopefully they know it in some way, right? So did that get at the, I don't know if that got at the
sure.
initial.
I mean, we could, to get into more his critique of the surrealist method, we could start at the top of the following paragraph, which is I don't really understand what he means by this. The first sentence of that paragraph, the trick.
Okay. So it transitions from the rest of this paragraph. So let's look at this. Leaving aside Aragon's Passage de l'Opera, Breton and Naja are the lovers who convert everything we have experienced on mournful railway journeys, railways of being into age, on godforsaken Sunday afternoons in the proletariat quarters of the great cities, in the first glance through the rain-blurred window of a new apartment, into revolutionary experience, if not action. They bring the immense forces of atmosphere concealed in these things to the point of explosion. You could also say aura. What form do you suppose a life would take that was determined at a decisive moment precisely by the street song last on everyone's lips? All right, so how to translate into revolutionary experience, if not action. So we've had previously the action becoming an image. Right, so action becoming an image. The question is, can image become action? right? So if the Surrealists are producing images, and they're producing dialectical images, how do these images potentially translate into action? Because they don't quite. So this sets up the issue. The trick by which this world of things is mastered, it is more proper to speak of a trick than a method, consists in the substitution of a political for a historical point of view. Open graves you, the dead of the picture galleries, corpses behind screens, and palaces, castles, and monasteries. Here stands the fabulous keeper of keys, holding a bunch of the keys to all times, who knows where to press the most artful lock, and invites you to step into the midst of the world of today, to mingle with the bearers of burdens, the mechanics whom money ennobles, to make yourself at home in their automobiles, which are beautiful as armor from the age of chivalry, to take your places in the international sleeping cars, and to weld yourself to all the people who today are still proud of their privileges, but civilization will give them short shrift. The speech is attributed by to Apollinaire by his friend Henri Hertz. Apollinaire originated this technique. In his volume of novellas, Le Heresiarch, he used it with Machiavellian calculation to blow Catholicism, to which he inwardly clung to smithereens. Okay, so not a trick, but a method. So why not a method? Because it's just a change of perspective, right? So it's not actually like doing anything. It's just like changing our perspective on things, which we'll see is, he's going to try to find significance in the dialectical image of this idea. Now, the substitution of a political for a historical point of view. Past and present. Right, so what Benjamin is going to argue for, and we'll go back to the beginning of the essay now to look at how he starts it out, is that he thinks the Germans are not seeing the new, but he thinks that the Surrealists are embracing the new, but not with a proper historical view. Right, so one of his criticisms of the Surrealists is that they're like the anarchists, meaning it's propaganda of the deed, it's actionism, it's revolutionary gymnastics, it's trying to work yourself up into a revolutionary action, but then what, right? So he basically, he sees the inability to follow through. And what I'll say about this, just to kind of cut to the chase, just so you guys keep it in mind, he thinks that the Surrealists are actually doing what capitalism does. They're actually doing what capitalism does. Which is fine. However, they think that they're doing something other than what capitalism does. That's the problem. So and it has to do with the dialectical image at the level of action and historical time, the relationship between present action and historical time.
In what sense are they doing what capitalism does?
They're trying to renovate the world. They're kind of, they're engaged in a kind of revolutionism, we might say, kind of reification of revolution. And again, it has to do with how they understand their own procedure and their own works. I don't know if we reviewed this last time or whether it was 2 classes ago that we were talking about critical reification. Right. So, not just using the term reification, let alone commodification as a pejorative, but seeing approaching it more dialectically and seeing the critical value of it. Meaning, if reification is a symptom of capitalism, then the question is, how do we get beyond capitalism in and through its symptoms, in and through its reifications? So of course that's what makes the Surrealists interesting, is that they are doing frank reifications. And so the question is how to understand those reifications critically. And in a way that has something to do with their self-understanding, but goes beyond their self-understanding. So not only what they're doing, but what they think that they're doing, both symptomatic, both pointing beyond themselves. Right, so this is going to be important when we get to, well, everything is heading towards the concept of history idea, which is about how to understand the possibility of redemption as a matter of freezing time. Okay, so in the title, Surrealism, the last snapshot of the European intelligentsia. So we have a kind of little image already, like straight away. We almost have a dialectical image in the title itself, which is to say that the last snapshot of the European intelligentsia, meaning kind of once you've taken a snapshot of something, even immediately after you've taken the picture, you're suddenly separated from that moment infinitely. It's sort of it becomes the past, and there's a kind of infinite separation that occurs. So the last snapshot, meaning there's some culminating moment where we're looking at Surrealism in hindsight. Even though it just happened, it's already receding infinitely into the past in hindsight. And that as such, it stands in for the European intelligentsia. Okay, so what the hell does that mean? We were just looking at the last bit of Breton, Madeleine, and he talked about her hand, his daughter's hand. And so there's a lot built into these ideas. Namely, the distinction between manual and intellectual labor, or physical and intellectual labor. Art. What is art? Intellectual labor. Artists are part of the intelligentsia. It doesn't matter how much physical effort it makes to create a work of art, it's not physical labor, it's not manual labor, because it's not about affecting the world physically, it's about affecting the world mentally, intellectually. It's about the mental. So it's not, again, like to produce an image might take a great deal of physical labor. However, it's meant to affect someone's mind, not their body. Of course, these things are really inseparable. Nonetheless, there is this issue of the status of the intellectuals. Right? So in revolutionary politics, Marxism, what's the relationship between the intellectuals and the workers? What's the relation between intellectual labor and physical labor? That's a question. So the way Marxists had dealt with it, in the period before World War I, before the crisis of Marxism and communists versus social democrats, et cetera, haunted by, shadowed by anarchism. I brought up anarchism. When Marxism became the dominant ideology of the socialist movement of the working class, there was this idea by Karl Kautsky, who's the Pope of Marxism, the way Breton is the Pope of Surrealism, but anyway, it's called the merger formula. So the merger formula is that the socialist parties were meant to be the merger of the socialist intelligentsia and the working class. And that both were changed in their status by virtue of uniting in the party. So the intellectuals became something other than, more and other than merely intellectuals, and the workers became something more and other than just workers. They became party militants. Right? But that doesn't mean that the distinction between intellectual and worker disappeared. It didn't. Right? The party itself was how they transcended their condition, but other than that, they remained what they were. This is important. Because the issue in the 20s and 30s is what's the relationship between art and revolution? What's the relationship between artists and writers and the revolution? The Russian Revolution happened, you have a mass communist movement, you have the rise of fascism, which in large measure is conditioned by trying to fight against communism as a threat. So artists, writers, they can't ignore this political phenomenon, which is overwhelmingly present and leads to World War II. And fascism leads to World War II. And fascism, you can't understand it other than as something rising up to prevent communism. Doesn't really have a meaning besides that, by the way. That's one of the reasons why we don't have fascism today. Or it's why both sides of this capitalist world have to call themselves fascists and communists and all this insanity. It's like they're living with ghosts. They're shadow boxing with ghosts. So Benjamin, again, in something that we're now reading in this course, but you can read if you're interested, it's in Reflections, the author as producer, does try to address this question of what's the role of writers and artists with respect to revolutionary politics. And what he says there is that it's not enough for them to have the correct political tendency, but rather they have to be good writers and good artists, otherwise they can't really be helping the revolution, meaning they can't just be hack propagandists. And this is in the time when, in fact, that is what's happening, is that the communist parties are demanding that writers and artists just become hack propagandists.
Is that in the same line of the commitment to essay by Adorno?
Yeah, Adorno
It's
definitely.
like the same thing, right?
It is the same thing. It is the same thing. Yeah, Adorno is a Benjaminian for sure.
Yes.
And the author as producer is very important for Adorno. So he says, a work without literary quality cannot be politically good. And the writer who doesn't teach other writers teaches no one. The artist who doesn't teach other artists teaches no one. And, he even goes so far as to say that bad art is bad politics. Like if it's aesthetically bad, if it's bad in quality, that is politically bad because it contributes to, the kitsch political world. Just by virtue of its form. Right? So this is his way of trying to deal with the attack on formalism by the socialist realists. Right? Okay. So anyway, the intellectuals have a role that's kind of a tricky role. They have a complementary role, they have a peculiar role, and there are various ways that they can misconstrue their role. So if you recall with Baudelaire, and Proust, and Kafka, why is Benjamin writing about these people at all? Aren't they just bourgeois decadents? Aren't they just misanthropes? Aren't they just narcissists? Why should we care about Proust or Kafka or Baudelaire at all? Okay, so Benjamin thinks it doesn't matter what their conscious politics might have been. What matters is the form of their work. And that's what's important to the proletariat. To some extent. So the author as producer, Roland Barthes is a little bit influenced by Benjamin, a little bit inspired by Benjamin. So the author as producer, there's a lot of overlap between that and Barthes, like the idea of not the author, but the writer. Although Barthes is also a little bit this, right? So it could stand for some Benjamin criticism too. The French fries. Anyway, no, he's. I have a soft spot for Barthes. I do. I have a soft spot for all of them, really. And also Foucault's criticism of Barthes in What is an Author is also valid, too. It's also valid, too. So, dialectics, children. Dialectics. All right, so intellectual currents can generate a sufficient head of water for the critic to install his power station on them. The necessary gradient in the case of surrealism is produced by the difference in intellectual level between France and Germany. What sprang up in 1919 in France in a small circle of literati, we shall give the most important names at once: André Breton, Louis Aragon, Philippe Soupeau, Robert Desnos, Paul Éluard, may have been a meager stream fed on the damp boredom of post-war Europe and the last trickle of French decadence. The know-alls who even today have not advanced beyond the authentic origins of the movement, and even now have nothing to say about it except that yet another clique of literati is here mystifying the honorable public, are a little like a gathering of experts at a spring who, after lengthy deliberation, arrive at the conviction that this paltry stream will never drive turbines. The German observer is not standing at the head of the stream. That is his opportunity. He is in the valley. He can gauge the energies of the movement. As a German, he is long acquainted with the crisis of the intelligentsia, or more precisely, with that of the humanistic concept of freedom. And he knows how frantic is the determination that is awakened in the movement to go beyond the stage of eternal discussion and at any price to reach a decision. He has had direct experience of its highly exposed position between an anarchistic front and a revolutionary discipline, and so has no excuse for taking the movement for the artistic, poetic one it superficially appears. If it was such at the outset, it was, however, precisely at the outset that Breton declared his intention of breaking with a praxis that presents the public with the literary precipitate of a certain form of existence while withholding that existence itself. Stated more briefly and dialectically, this means that the sphere of poetry was here explored from within by a closely knit circle of people pushing the poetic life to the utmost limits of possibility. Okay, so did we do the imminent dialectical critique of phenomenon? Okay, good. All right, so let's see how he's setting it up here. All right, so France is ahead of the curve with respect to Germany, historically. So we've talked about this in terms of, so there's a little bit of a paradox here, we might say. So we've got our Industrial Revolution. We've got our late bourgeois revolutions, the American and French revolutions. We've got the July Revolution of 1830, and then of course we've got the revolutions of 1848. Which the most dramatic events of 1848 occurred in France and Germany. We've got the Second Republic, we've got the Second Empire, we've got the Franco-Prussian War, and then finally we've got World War I and the revolutions. Okay, so socialism was invented in France. Socialism was invented in France. So there's a phrase. It's from Lenin, and then sort of abused by Stalin. And it's also there. Engels has a way of explaining this that Lenin took from Engels on this. The three component parts of Marxism. So British political economy, French socialism and German philosophy. Okay, so why is that usually screwed up? Because, of course, Marxism is the critique of all three of those things. It's the critique of British political economy, the critique of German philosophy, and the critique of French socialism. Right, so socialism is something that originates, Socialism originates in the aftermath of the French Revolution. It comes out of the Jacobins who are being suppressed. It comes from Gracchus Babeuf, The Conspiracy of Equals. And then it's developed by the utopian socialists who we'll be talking about in a few weeks, namely Charles Fourier, Saint-Simon, and others, but they're heavily French utopian socialism. So the first industrial revolution we've talked about that as like a matter of the UK, France, and the Benelux countries. The second industrial revolution is the US, Germany, Japan, Italy, and Russia. So Germany is behind France in terms of the history of capitalism. So the industrialization of Germany happens after the Franco-Prussian War. The industrialization of France happens before 1850. The arcades, 1830s. Utopian socialism, 1820s, 1830s. And then the 1840s, the period leading up to the revolutions of 1848, the 140s, we talked about that. Okay, so Marxism. So here's your paradox, is that we've got socialism, but then we've got Marxism. And even though Marx himself is a 1848 guy, Marxism is after his time. Marxism is the Second Industrial Revolution era, leading up to World War I. So, in the time before World War I, the socialist movement in Germany is Marxist. The French, not so much. The French, it's more heterodox. There is French Marxism, but it has this older tradition. So France is socially and culturally ahead of Germany, but Germany is politically ahead of France. And the fact that you could have that contradiction between being politically ahead and socially and culturally behind is actually part of the way capitalism works. Capitalism works through combined and uneven development, contradictory historical development. So for instance, the US, it's affected by the industrialization of France and the UK, but really develops industry after the Civil War. Japan also, Meiji Restoration, the defeat of the samurai by the emperor and the centralization of the state. That's the industrial era. Italy and Russia. I will also point out that these are the countries where Marxism has the most influence in the socialist movement, more than in the UK and France. And Russia was actually, before World War I, home to the largest factories in the world. So Russia was not, it was backwards, yes, extremely, parts of it, but other parts of it were very advanced, meaning more advanced industrial production conditions than in the UK and France. Okay. So the relationship between, again, being ahead and being behind, that's part of what needs to be grasped. How can something that is behind be ahead? And how can something that's ahead be behind? That's what this metaphor is trying to get at with the paltry stream and the valley and the mountain and the which way are you looking at things, up or down, and the gradient. Right, so, now, as a German who's long acquainted with the crisis of the intelligentsia, or more precisely with that of the humanistic concept of freedom, the crisis of the humanistic concept of freedom. Okay, so what's that about? All right, so German idealist philosophy, German philosophy, Kant and Hegel. What Marx said about them is that whereas the British and the Americans and the French did revolution politically in practice, the Germans just thought about it. And that's why they're the home of revolutionary philosophy. In other words, Kant and Hegel are the revolutionary philosophers that you don't find in the British and French and American worlds. So there's a kind of a split between revolution in practice and revolution in theory. And the revolution in theory is expressed by German philosophy, by Kant and Hegel. And why? Because Germany is backwards. And because it's backwards, the philosophers can only view the revolution from afar and think about it. They can't actually participate in it. But that's their advantage. Their advantage is that because they don't have to get involved in it, and because they're not releasing their energies practically, they channel it into theory, into philosophy. Yeah. Because both Kant and Hegel are big fans of the revolution. They love the American and French revolutions, big time. So Kant is, of course, before the French Revolution. He loves the American Revolution. He loves the English Revolution before that. He loves all that stuff. Hegel, of course, is a contemporary, the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, and he's a big enthusiast. Right, so that's part of what Benjamin is doing here. Now, that's that old history. Now, what's also interesting is that Kant and Hegel are the philosophers in the era of Romanticism, right, as opposed to modernism, and as opposed to realism. So the Germans are like the home of Romanticism, and they carry on. In other words, they don't really get with the program of either realism or modernism until fairly late. So this period of Marxism is also the period of high modernism. But it's not really expressed in Germany. Right, high modernism is a French thing. And insofar as it's in the German-speaking world at all, paradoxically, it's in the more provincial part of the German-speaking world, namely Austria. Vienna is where you get modernism registering more so than in Germany proper. Sorry, there are many gears turning, many wheels turning, but we have to keep all that in mind because he assumes his reader knows what he's talking about. Do we? We do not know what he's talking about, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, but what are the reasons that high modernism didn't develop in Germany?
Because of Romanticism. Because Romanticism is like, there's a hangover of Romanticism.
Okay.
And so basically the idea is that insofar as Germans do modernism, their self-understanding of it is still romantic.
Mm.
Whereas Baudelaire is very clearly trying to break with romanticism. Right.
So is that sort of vestigial romanticism that's obstructing high modernism, the crisis of humanistic concept of freedom?
Okay, so let's unpack that. So humanistic concept of freedom would be bourgeois freedom.
Okay.
And that would be this kind of Renaissance idea, so it's humanism. But what is romanticism? Romanticism is the disenchantment with that. Meaning romanticism is the crisis of that. Meaning it's bound up with the French Revolution, and it seems like the revolution goes wrong in a way that people didn't think the American Revolution went wrong, but they did think the French Revolution went wrong. And the Germans are very central to that understanding of the French Revolution having gone wrong, since it's the German-speaking world that leads the counter-revolution against Napoleon. Right, the rising of the peoples against Napoleonic rule is led by the Germans. And it's total romanticism, like Goya, like the 5th of May, the painting, right? This is romanticism, right? So romanticism is bound up with the counter-revolution, in fact. So now the question is it just reactionary? No, it's not just reactionary. Because after all, there is a crisis of the humanistic concept of freedom. There is a crisis of bourgeois society. There is a crisis of the bourgeois revolution. There is. There clearly is. And even though it's kind of early to attribute it to the French Revolution, still the seeds are planted there for, okay, what is the proper response to the crisis of bourgeois society? Is it reactionary or is it revolutionary? And how do you even separate those two things, actually? Maybe you can't.
So that later on, he says, characteristic of this whole left-wing bourgeois position is that your irremediable coupling of idealistic morality with political practice. Is that sort of what he's addressing?
That's right. Yeah, so the ideal and the real, like to go back to Kant and Hegel, like the idea of a dialectical relationship between the ideal and the real, which is like productive and generative, and that you work it out that way. It seems like there's more of a flat opposition. Right. So now again, from a more conventional Marxist standpoint, idealism is reactionary, and one needs to be materialist and not idealist. One has to deal with reality, political, social reality, and not just with mere ideals. That if you traffic in mere ideals, that is the way you're going to be reactionary, because making the revolution is going to violate all the bourgeois ideals. Now, but paradoxically, it's going to be motivated by the bourgeois ideals, but it's going to violate the bourgeois ideals. Now, I mention this because Marxism. So I mentioned Kautsky. So the Second International, which is from the era of the Second Industrial Revolution, is founded in 1889 on the centenary of the French Revolution of 1789. And what they say is, the Marxists announce, we're starting this new international because the bourgeoisie have abandoned the revolution and the revolutionary ideals, and now it's the working class and the proletariat that will carry it forward. So the capitalists have betrayed liberty, equality, fraternity, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and now the working class has to take up those ideals. Okay, so on the one hand, on the other hand, capitalism violates those ideals, and the working class in its struggle for socialism is part of capitalism. And being part of capitalism, its struggle is also going to violate those bourgeois ideals. So again, the dialectical approach between the ideal and the real, recognizing the contradiction and the actual contradiction. which is a problem for the intelligentsia. So the intelligentsia, hold on one second. So you'll notice that the US, Germany, Japan, Italy, Russia. Do you notice those three countries, Germany, Japan, and Italy? Those are fascist countries. And guess what? Where does fascism come from? I don't know if we've talked about this. Mussolini was a Marxist. Fascism comes from Marxism. Because Mussolini was like, you know what? This Marxism is too bourgeois. It's too humanistic. We need to be more revolutionary. And so he invents a new ideology. So it's to oppose Marxism as being insufficiently revolutionary in its practical as well as ideal values. That's fascism. It's trying to compete with Marxism for revolutionary bona fides. As of course the anarchists do too, in their own way. Okay, so it's also Italy and Russia and the US, on the other hand, are also the countries of anarchism. Big time. France historically, but less in that later period. There was another point to this. Oh yeah, the ideal. So the fact that revolutionary politics, oh, here we go, because the fascists, okay. So the fascists decide, Mussolini was a Second International Marxist. He was a Marxist who was like, the working class is the upholder of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And of course, Italy's rather backward, we have to admit. Is still, but was. He flips, and he's like, no, to be revolutionary now, it means not upholding those ideals, but fighting against those ideals. In other words, those are a bourgeois lie. Liberty, equality, and fraternity are a bourgeois lie that keeps capitalism going, and so we have to reject those ideals. And when Hitler takes power in 1933, Goebbels, the propagandist, declares, we will now begin to undo 1789. Right, so to be revolutionary, to be truly revolutionary, one could go in the direction of it's to fulfill these ideals, one could go in the direction of it's to reject these ideals. But both would be at the level of ideals. Now in practice, so the liberals are there to say, in practice, aren't the fascists and the Marxists very similar? Of course, they're right about that too. Right, so it's kind of this insoluble contradiction. And then the question is, how does one not resolve the contradiction, but deal with it, navigate it? How does it get expressed? How is it embodied? Right, so that's why you can't just go for a kind of purely aesthetic approach to the Surrealists, nor can you go for a purely political approach to the Surrealists. And you can't accept what they say exactly, but you have to take what they say seriously. And you can't just go with what they do either. You have to keep in mind the relationship between what they say and what they do. And that in both instances, in their practice and in their theory, and in their relationship between the practice and theory, contradiction is going to show up in all those domains. Mm-hmm.
It feels like probably what we are talking now about this contradiction of ideal and real. There is a quote that might work on page 184. Yeah, so Breton indicates it's an introduction au discours sur le cours de l'Été, how the philosophical realism of the Middle Ages was the basis of poetic experience. This realism, however, that is the belief in a real separate existence of concepts, whether outside or inside things, has always very quickly crossed over from logical realm of ideas to the magical realm of words. Yeah, like does it fit into this scheme?
All right, so let's unpack that a bit. Yeah, that's good because Middle Ages, right? And again, esotericism, esoteric poetry. We could also say Gnostical theology, Gnosticism. It would be another point. So the philosophical realism of the Middle Ages is different from what we would now consider to be philosophical realism in the bourgeois era. So how is it different? Well, because it's bound up with theology. Now, we've talked about allegory previously, and now's a good opportunity for us to bring allegory back in. Meaning, how is reality allegorical? How is reality itself an allegory? Right, so allegory is not just in the realm of art, it's in reality itself. Right, so art is allegorical because reality is allegorical. That might still be true. However, we have to think of how it's true, what form that takes. Now, poetic experience as a kind of mysticism, not in a negative sense or pejorative sense, but in a more positive sense of, okay, well, how would we describe mysticism? So notice, realism is idealism. The belief in a real separate existence of concepts, whether outside or inside things. So for some reason, I've found myself in the last couple of months engaged in a debate with a Platonist, Benjamin Studebaker. Yeah, so anyway, Platonism, right? And his whole thing is, well, Chris would be a better Marxist if you were a Platonist. And I was like, okay. And I had to sort of remind myself why that might be the case. It's because he thinks that only Platonism is truly dialectical. That Marxism is too Aristotelian, which means undialectical. Okay, fine. All right, so, but there is Platonism versus Aristotelianism in medieval theology. Like, this is an issue. It's a kind of a live issue, I guess. I don't know. And generally, like, this is going to sound a little bit off the wall. Plato's the idealist, and Aristotle is the realist or the materialist. That's the way it's usually understood. Is that Aristotle is, even though he is himself a student of Plato, is more of a materialist than Plato is. Okay, so it also goes to nominalism. So nominalism in medieval theology is the antipode to Platonism. So nominalism is the idea that, did we talk about the univocity of being? I don't know if we have. We have not talked about that. Duns Scotus, that's the medieval theologian that Heidegger wrote his dissertation on, and that is the key to all of Heidegger's philosophy as far as I'm concerned. So the idea is that all of God's creations speak with their own voices, their own particular voices, but they all speak with the voice of God. Right, so the univocity of being, meaning each of God's creations is its own voice of God, but they're all the voice of God. So nominalism, meaning that God has different creations, and they're different from each other, and yet they all are equally valid as expressions of God. Postmodernism has a lot of those to it. Postmodernism has a lot of nominalism to it. As opposed to Platonism, which is less particularistic and more universalistic, and is about like the one, the unity of the one, and how everything is a separate part of the one, and we're constantly trying to bring back together what has been separated. So these two strands. So what is the status of concepts? What's the status of ideas? Or what's the status of concepts? Meaning, is the relationship between words and concepts? So the word concept, by the way, so in German it's Begriff. So they also have the word idea, and then but they have the word Begriff, which basically means the same thing as the Latin word concept. So Begriff is like what you grasp something with, and concept is the same thing, that with which you grasp something. So you apprehend something, you grasp something. Begriff. So words and concepts. If words grasp their object, how do they grasp their object? Right. So there's the practical notion of concepts. That's the Kantian notion, which is that we get our concepts from our practices. But yet there's a deeper understanding, which is that words can have a magical power, the relationship between word and object, in terms of words being a concept of the object, would be how, why you would think that saying something, speaking a spell, would affect reality. It's some kind of intrinsic relationship between words and objects. So the logical realm of ideas to the magical realm of words. So the logical realm of ideas would be like philosophy, would be like a philosophical system and a kind of attempt to logically, through philosophy, grasp the totality of reality. So metaphysics, the idea that philosophy as a metaphysics corresponds to reality. So that's the sort of tension that he's setting up here. So that's where he's saying, okay, they are romantics. They are romantics. Meaning what they're doing is less trying to create a system, the way the Enlightenment encyclopedists and others, or Kant and Hegel, might have been trying to come up with a system, more than they're doing these experiments with words that have more to do with like magic. So I mentioned it's romantic in the sense of there's a disenchantment with philosophy. Romanticism does involve a disenchantment with philosophy. It does involve a disenchantment with like logical systems. So the idea is that, well, the modern world, even though it seems to have been, at least in part, brought into existence with these systems of philosophical idealism, has not worked out that way. And so it's like, well, actually, maybe people were more on to the truth when they were grasping a more mystical experience of the magical power of words.
I have a question about this romanticism, because before you said romanticism is partly the disenchantment of the bourgeois concept of freedom, but it sees the flaws in the bourgeois revolutions, but it also carries the seed to move beyond. But there's always this critique of romanticism that it is occupied with being and not becoming. So what is the seed that carries us beyond? Is it dialectics through Hegel, or what is it that romanticism carries that moves us beyond? Because if it is dialectics, then why is it always criticized for being
Undialectical.
Exactly.
All right, so I will just say, just so very briefly, in terms of the history of philosophy, Hegel tries to deal with the romantic objection to Enlightenment by saying that it should be both, right? It should be both the Enlightenment, but also should be true to what the Enlightenment seems to suppress. So, again, the question is, when does Romanticism really begin? Meaning, is Kant just an Enlightenment guy, or is he also a Romantic guy? And then the question is, why is there this splitting that seems to occur between Kant and Hegel's time, between the Enlightenment and Romanticism? Now, I'll just say that Romanticism is not equivalent to the Counter-Enlightenment, but it is related to it. Like, it's not equivalent, but it is related. Meaning you can't reduce Romanticism to counter-Enlightenment, but there's a lot of overlap there. So the question is whether Romanticism itself is a continuation or a rejection of the Enlightenment. Meaning, if Romanticism rejects the Enlightenment, in what's the purpose of that? The purpose of it could be understood to fulfill the Enlightenment rather than to just turn back on it. So that would be my caveat with respect to this, is that it's not like there are simply two sides, right? Because Romanticism is the continuation of the Enlightenment, even while it's also a disenchantment with it. The question is how one understands Romanticism. So Hegel's understanding of Romanticism is that even though it wants to go back to the Middle Ages and wants to go back to classical antiquity, it, of course, can't do that, and really isn't about that. That it is still about bourgeois society, bourgeois freedom, bourgeois emancipation, and needs to be understood that way. So we could say that Hegel is the one who initiates the idea that one should pay attention to the Romantics more in what they do than in their self-understanding. And that one should even take their self-understanding seriously, if not simply in their own terms. Right. So Hegel treated Romanticism as a symptom, and a symptom of a misrecognition, but also as true. Benjamin's doing something similar with modernism. So Hegel's response to Romanticism is something that Benjamin's trying to do with modernism, which is to say, you have to take it seriously in its practice and in its theory. You even have to take its theory seriously, even though you don't accept its own theoretical self-understanding of what it's doing. But that doesn't mean you just throw out its own theory either, right? You just see in the theory itself a self-contradiction, and not only a contradiction between the theory and the practice.
Look at a passage really.
Sure.
Starts at the bottom of 186 and goes through the top of 187.
Mm-hmm.
Was the thing I quoted earlier.
Oh, this thing. Okay,
Yeah.
so characteristic of the whole left-wing bourgeois position is its irremediable coupling of idealistic morality with political practice. Only in contrast to the helpless compromises of sentiment are certain central features of Surrealism, indeed of the Surrealist tradition, to be understood. Little has happened so far to promote this understanding. The seduction was too great to regard the Satanism of Rimbaud and Lautréamont as a pendant to art for art's sake, in an inventory of snobbery. If, however, one resolves to open up this romantic dummy, one finds something usable inside. One finds the cult of evil as a political device, however romantic, to disinfect and isolate against all moralizing dilettantism. Yeah.
It made me think of like some Bataille I'd read.
Sure.
Just, like being gross
Sure.
and evil. But I'd love to like situate that within like capital R Romanticism, where it's like, he's using lowercase r.
We might as well use capital.
Okay.
Capital.
Okay.
This is like something that English translators like have a hard time with the fact that everything is capitalized in German, right? But not everything is capitalized in English. So the things that are capitalized in English are when you're going from an empirical to a metaphysical object. So romantic as just a descriptive versus romantic meaning like the movement or the historical phenomenon, right? Or romanticism, right? That's of course what he means. And I just thought of de Sade. And what is de Sade? Is de Sade a counter-enlightenment or enlightenment? Right? And actually Horkheimer and Adorno, not least influenced by Benjamin, wrote a chapter of their Dialectic of Enlightenment on de Sade, on Kant and de Sade. And maybe de Sade is a Kantian, which you would think, how could he possibly be a Kantian? The way we understand Kantian morality, de Sade would seem to violate, and that's why he goes with There he goes. What Benjamin says, convinced of this and coming across the scenario of a horror play by Breton that centers about a violation of children, one might perhaps go back a few decades. Right. So, you see, it's kind of like, oh, aren't the surrealists just sort of retreading all this stuff? They're retreading Baudelaire, but they're even retreading the roots for Baudelaire, which are de Sade.
As Benjamin said, it's best not to take Baudelaire's Satanism too literally.
Right.
It's a,
Absolutely. That's right. Meaning, okay, so what does he set up? It's the morality practice, like idealistic morality and political practice, right? Because like moral phenomena or immoral phenomena, evil, is just an aesthetic image for both Baudelaire and the Surrealists. And yet they will say, you know, no, we actually want to do these things in practice. Like, and Bataille actually did, you know, him and his group, they did do some ritual murder of someone to have the experience of murder. Yeah. Oh no, everything was done. All evil has been done. In the name of something or other, revolution, whatever. Right? Yeah, Bataille, poor Bataille. No, I mean, Bataille is fine, but people who are into Bataille, I'm suspicious. I am suspicious, sorry. Have to be. Right? Because it's like, yeah, don't, yeah, not really. You know, like, in other words, the world is horrible enough. You don't have to contribute to the horror in order to feel what it's really like. It's like, we already know what it's really like. We're living it every day. Danny, you had a question before. I hope we haven't left that moment behind. Did we? Oh no.
It wasn't a question.
Oh, what was it?
I was just gonna say that, like, we were talking about like magic and objects, and I was gonna say that, you know, abracadabra translates to like I speak it into existence.
Right.
From like Aramaic and
Yes.
origins.
That's right.
So I think, you know, like returning, like this idea of like a return to the magical. There is actually like a realism to that is more palpable in like the magical tradition, because it is about like moving concept into material existence. So I just thought that was helpful. Like that Benjamin knew that.
It's keying into that. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Because of course we don't have ideas outside of reality. We are part of reality. Our ideas are part of reality. The fact that we experience ideas as separate from reality is itself something for us to consider rather than just take for granted. Right. So, and again, ancient peoples had their way of dealing with this, and so do we have our ways of trying to deal with this.
Could journalism be like that in manifest, this, like these words creating circumstance?
It is a little bit like that. No, I mean, the way that I've experienced it myself, so I told you guys I dabbled in some journalistic writings this year, whether to my benefit or detriment to something else. I mean, I'm happy with what I did, but whatever. But it is sort of like magical thinking, means that if you say it, you're somehow doing it. And it's like really insane, like the tabooing. That it's like if you use the wrong words, or if you describe things a certain way, that somehow you are like approving of it, you're endorsing it, you're like contributing to it. And it's like, oh fuck, you know? Whereas of course, you know, I have more of a modernist understanding of these things and of literary, you know, phenomena, which is that, you know, you say it also to protest it. You know, and you know, like, you know what I mean? In other words, was Breton endorsing like the abuse of children? Probably not, right? And yet sometimes artists and writers are like, and this is l'art polar, by the way, art for art's sake. Théophile Gautier, his whole l'art polar little manifesto, mini manifesto, is about like to describe something is not the same thing as to do it. Right, and so to try to find a practical utility for literature as if it's moral instruction is just like pointless. Now Breton also, not Breton, Baudelaire. Baudelaire also says something similar in his prefaces to the drafts of a preface to the Fleur de Mal, right? So, what is the relationship between literature and morality? And of course, like, depicting evil is not to advocate evil. It might actually be to protest evil, or it might be neither of those things. It might be neither to advocate nor to protest, but to deal with it.
Yeah, here is an evening quote Baudelaire, right on the next page.
Uh-huh.
In the second, 88, yeah. On this next page.
Oh, yeah.
So of course, I stumbled well the note to bring something new into the literature that, after all the things to do all disappear in order to depress the reader and thus make him alone all the more intensely for goodness as a remedy.
That's right.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah, I mean, let's finish this out. So that in the end, one really sings only of goodness, only the method is more philosophical and less naive than that of the old school, of which only Victor Hugo and a few others are still alive. And if you recall from the Paris of the Second Empire in Baudelaire, that Benjamin establishes this kind of Hugo versus Baudelaire.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and Hugo would be acceptable to the socialist realists, to the Marxists. Hugo would also be kitsch in comparison to Baudelaire as avant-garde. So, which is not just to discourage Hugo, but nonetheless, Baudelaire was self-conscious in realizing that maybe Hugo in his goodness was actually performing a more evil function than he himself in his Satanism was actually doing. Right? Because obviously if you just write about the prostitute with the heart of gold and and how like the criminals are actually the good guys and not the bad guys, like really, like this is just sentimentalization of the depravity rather than really, morally contributing to the good. Yeah, Pablo, sorry.
Yeah, can we dive a little into Rimbaud?
Oh, sure.
Because they like Benjamin goes back to this like repeatedly, even before this Dostoevsky. Oh, even there, Dostoevsky, Rimbaud, and he mentions César en Enfer. No? Like,
yeah, Season in Hell.
Yeah, that. How is it called in English?
Season in Hell.
In Hell. Okay, Season in Hell. So how does it, like, why is it part of the picture here, like Season in Hell? Like this, like, how's the relation here between the profane and this, what Benjamin calls the dialectics of intoxication, too?
And that's really the point. Okay, so let's look at this. So he says, these are such complex sentences, aren't they? It's good, absurd. It's like two completely different things mashed up. Like between 1865 and 1875, a number of great anarchists, without knowing of one another, worked on their infernal machines. So the bombs that they were going to throw. And the astonishing thing is that independently of one another, they set its clock at exactly the same hour. Right? So they're setting off a time bomb, or setting the time for the time bomb. And 40 years later in Western Europe, the writings of Dostoevsky, Rimbaud, and Lautréamont exploded at the same time. So 40 years after 1875 is 1915. That's World War I. Okay. So one might, to be more exact, select from Dostoevsky's entire work the one episode that was actually not published until about 1915, Stavrogin's Confession from the Possessed. This chapter, which touches very closely on the third canto of Chants de Moldoror, contains a justification of evil in which certain motifs of surrealism are more powerfully expressed than by any of its present spokesmen. For Stavrogen is a surrealist avant la lettre, before the word. No one else understood as he did how naive is the view of the Philistines that goodness, for all the manly virtue of those who practice it, is God-inspired. whereas evil stems entirely from our spontaneity, and in it we are independent and self-sufficient beings. No one else saw inspiration as he did in even the most ignoble actions, and precisely in them. He considers vileness itself as something preformed, both in the course of the world and also in ourselves, to which we are disposed, if not called, as the bourgeois idealist sees virtue. Disposed if not called, as the bourgeois idealist sees virtue. Dostoevsky's God created not only heaven and earth, and man and beast, but also baseness, vengeance, cruelty. And here too, he gave the devil no opportunity to meddle in his handiwork. That is why all these vices have a pristine vitality in his work. They are perhaps not splendid, but eternally new as on the first day, separated by an infinity from the cliches through which sin is perceived by the Philistine. Okay, so what is
he goes back to Rimbaud at the end of the next page too, like right there. Rimbaud is indeed a Catholic there.
Okay. Let's see. Where's he going with this?
Because my question is that I understand what he says about Rimbaud, but I don't understand how it fits into the surrealist frame.
Okay.
Because Rimbaud in Season in Hell is deliberately profane, right? He's like, I sit Venus in my lap, all this. But why does it matter for the surrealist?
Well, okay. All right, so he's got the commune in here. So let's just unpack this. Okay, so Rimbaud is indeed a Catholic, but he is one by his own account in the most wretched part of himself, which does not tire of denouncing and consigning to his own and everyone's hatred, his own and everyone's contempt. The part that forces him to confess that he does not understand revolt. Okay, so the Catholic is the most wretched part of himself that does not understand revolt. That is the concession of a communard dissatisfied with his own contribution, who by the time he turned his back on poetry, had long since in his earliest work taken leave of religion. Hatred, to you I have entrusted my treasure, he writes in The Season in Hell. This is another dictum around which a poetics of surrealism might grow like a climbing plant, to sink its roots deeper than the theory of surprised creation originated by Apollinaire to the depth of the insights of Poe. And we'll talk about Poe and Baudelaire. All right, so let's unpack this, because this is rather complicated. So, a communard, Paris Commune, dissatisfied with his own contribution, that it's, what Benjamin is saying is the same thing that caused Rimbaud to become politically disenchanted also caused him to become disenchanted with poetry. So, you guys know what happened to Rimbaud? He went to Africa and became a slave trader, right? Yeah. Yeah, it's all right. It's like, what's his name? Kurtz in the Heart of Darkness, yes. I was going to say, Apocalypse Now. Right, so, in other words, he went from a poetics evil to the actual practice of evil, but that meant giving up the poetics of evil, which was coincidental with his giving up his politics altogether, which were those of the communard. Now, why this is important for Benjamin is that Benjamin, as a Marxist, is aware of Marx's critique of the commune in its anarchist self-understanding. So the commune was led by anarchists, and Marx thought that that's why it failed. Right? In other words, what it did was good, but its self-understanding proved to be a fatal flaw in it. And again, it had to do with this morality question and morality and political action question, because the commune, in order to survive and succeed, would have had to have taken action that it felt it didn't have the right to do. Namely, it would have had to launch an attack on the provisional government, leave Paris, do something that it wasn't mandated to do as the municipal government of Paris. Right, so in other words, its practical needs came up against its morality and also its political theory. Namely, anarchism is all about like local governance and against centralization, et cetera, et cetera.
So surrealists are like the anarchists of the image, in a way?
In a way, they are, yes. So he brought up the anarchist Fronde, and the Fronde, that's another weird like historical reference. It's a reference to a civil war among the nobility in France before the rise of Louis XIV. So Louis XIV established absolutism in France by subduing the aristocracy. And so when understanding like the emergence of bourgeois society through this process of a civil war among the aristocracy and then the centralization of the state under an absolute monarch, from a Marxist perspective, the centralization of the state under an absolute monarch is actually part of the bourgeois revolution. It's part of the transformation of society, because the bourgeoisie sides with the monarchy against the nobility. And also that liberalism, and even in a certain respect democracy, is connected to absolutism. So one of the misunderstandings that people have about the revolutions is that they're somehow revolutions against the monarchy. There actually aren't. They're more revolutions against the established religion and the aristocracy. So, because the hope is that the king will take the side of the bourgeoisie, and then when they don't, then it becomes against the monarchy. So, anyway, the anarchism of the image, that brings in the question of revolutionary discipline. Let's hold that thought, take a break, and come back.
Like in the name of preserving the promises of bourgeois society, does kind of make me think of the tie, kind of the notion of like, to really respect a code of rules, like you have to if you don't transgress it, you're not really taking it seriously, essentially. Or that, I guess the other way, like the ultimate way of codifying it is to transgress it.
Yeah,
Well, again, the question is, what did he mean by that?
Well, yeah, I mean,
Right? Similar thought.
it sounds great, but what does it mean?
Yeah, but what does it actually mean? It's almost like the exception proves the rule.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think that this is a trouble with poets, is when they say things, it's like, okay, like, am I supposed to be taking you literally, or do I just say, like, you know what, here's what I like. This is what you mean now.
Right, right. Well, I guess Bataille was a poet, wasn't he?
Mm-hmm. I mean, he gets identified that way a lot, which is kind of funny, because I think of him more as like a philosopher.
When I say anthropologist, I don't know what he is.
Yeah.
You know, the story of the eye.
Yeah. I don't know how. Erotism is kind of anthropology.
Erotism is anthropology, yeah.
Yeah. I did like that, because early on in the book, he's like, okay, here's what I would imagine early civilization being like.
Right.
Like, let's just jump from there.
To sacrifice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I mentioned this. René Girard is big now.
Mm-hmm.
For whatever reason, it's the Christian anthropology.
Yeah.
The idea that all cultures are based on a founding sacrifice, and so Christianity is based on. And so the form that founding sacrifice takes determines the values of the culture.
That is interesting.
Yeah, and so Christian civilization is based on the character of the founding sacrifice of Jesus. Maybe. But it's yeah. I don't think it's good to understand capitalism as Christianity.
No.
Right.
Yeah, that's why I was scared, that's why I wrote
It does feel like it would resonate with the stupidest parts of like Dugan.
Yeah,
kind
this
of.
Westernism, yeah, and civilizationism, yeah.
It's like, oh, well, congrats. It's like, actually, it's just Protestantism.
Right.
It's just Protestantism. If we just do like what a good, if we figure out the good Christianity.
Eastern Orthodox.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We can just get rid of all that
I think it'll
shit.
be fun to.
And people have done that too. They've converted to Orthodoxy, not just to Catholicism.
Thank you.
It is. I mean, it does make a lot of sense that it's like, okay, people are looking for something, and so they convert to like the two most like visually overwhelming. Like you're like, okay, we're going to really literalize all of the ritual elements of
Oh yeah,
this.
that's right. Yeah, because people don't like the abstraction of Protestantism,
Yeah.
or bourgeois society.
Yeah.
All right, let's all resume. We've only got a half an hour. I want to do justice to the ideas here. What's missing? Okay. I was going to refer to her notes. Anyway, we talked about a little bit about evil as a device. But what about maybe the central concept in the Surrealism essay by Benjamin, and that's profane illumination. Right, so we have the dialectical image, but we have to think about what the dialectical image is supposed to do. And that's profane illumination. And so profane as opposed to religious or sacred illumination. Right, so what kind of a revelation is profane illumination? So if revelation or revealed religion, that's another phrase, an old-fashioned phrase, which is to, God's will is revealed in the world. As opposed to occult religion, which is that God's will or the God's wills are not revealed in the world. No, the idea is that the world does reveal God's will, depending on how we look at it. So, profane illumination, on the other hand, would be, and again, to bring back the theologico-political fragment that we looked at a few weeks ago, would be to look at what secular history reveals. I mean, profane illumination is historical revelation, as opposed to God's will. It has something to do with the revelation of freedom. Which, by the way, the whole theodicy thing, namely, did God create evil or not? And is evil the product of defining God, whether that's Lucifer or whether it's Adam and Eve eating from the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge, in an act of freedom, in an act of free choice, right? So we have basically evil is attributed to freedom in that tradition, in the so-called Judeo-Christian tradition. But then there's the question that theologians have always had to struggle over, which is, why did God create evil? Why did he create the possibility of evil? Right? So if God didn't want us to choose evil, why did he make us free? Right, so the idea is that we have to be free to choose evil in order to therefore be able to choose God. Whereas if God didn't create evil and didn't create freedom, then we would never have the opportunity and therefore obligation to choose God. Right, so that choice becomes important. Or that freedom becomes important again. So freedom might have led to evil, but it will ultimately lead back to God. So why did God create anything at all? Was God figuring out his own intention in creating things? By the way, so I know that we've touched on these things before. When we were talking about Kant early in the semester, Spinoza, right? Monism as opposed to dualism. Basically, Kant and Hegel both have the idea that you can't really conceive of freedom without dualism. Meaning monism basically eliminates the question of freedom. That you need dualism to think about change, to think about transformation, and therefore to think about freedom. Okay, so profane illumination. Materialistic inspiration, a moment of realization akin to and replacement of religious epiphany that reveals metaphysical importance within one's experience with material objects, people, and space. So, yeah, this is the central concept in Benjamin's essay. Let's look at this. This is towards the end of the essay. Or maybe not as close to the end of the essay. Okay. As I thought. Okay, since Bakunin, Europe has lacked a radical concept of freedom. The Surrealists have one. So Bakunin is the big anarchist opponent of Marx and Marxism. They are the first to liquidate the sclerotic, liberal, moral, humanistic ideal of freedom because they are convinced that freedom, which on this earth can only be bought with 1,000 of the hardest sacrifices, must be enjoyed unrestrictedly in its fullest without any kind of pragmatic calculation as long as it lasts. And this proves to them that, quote, mankind's struggle for liberation in its simplest revolutionary form, which, however, is liberation in every respect, remains the only cause worth serving. But are they successful in welding this experience of freedom to the other revolutionary experience that we have to acknowledge because it has been ours, namely the constructive dictatorial side of revolution? So of course he means ours, meaning Marxists. In short, have they bound revolt to revolution? How are we to imagine an existence oriented solely toward Boulevard Bonneval in rooms by Le Corbusier? To win the energies of intoxication for the revolution. This is the project about which Surrealism circles in all its books and enterprises. This, it may call its most particular task. For them, it is not enough that, as we know, an ecstatic component lives in every revolutionary act. So ecstatic in this sense philosophically means it transcends the particular time and space. This component is identical with the anarchic, but to place the accent exclusively on it would be to subordinate the methodical and disciplinary preparation for revolution entirely to a praxis oscillating between fitness exercises and celebration in advance. Or revolutionary gymnastics. It's the phrase I used earlier, which I thought was here, but maybe it's not. I think it's London. It says revolutionary gymnastics. Yeah, it's London. Added to this is an inadequate, undialectical conception of the nature of intoxication. The aesthetic of the painter, the poet, in a state of surprise, of art as the reaction of one surprised, is enmeshed in a number of pernicious romantic prejudices. Any serious exploration of occult, surrealistic, phantasmagoric gifts and phenomena presupposes a dialectical intertwinement to which a romantic turn of mind is impervious. For histrionic or fanatical stress on the mysterious side of the mysterious takes us no further. We penetrate the mystery only to the degree that we recognize it in the everyday world, by virtue of a dialectical optic that perceives the everyday as impenetrable and the impenetrable as everyday. This gets back to our discussion of the Enlightenment, in fact. So, Enlightenment is, the disenchantment of the world and rendering everything transparent. Right, sort of dispelling the mists of theological superstition. So what about the fact, however, that in the 19th century, as I think did we discuss this? Did we look at the Louis Menand and the Marx? Did we look at I think that we did. Marx and Engels as philosophers of a second enlightenment? Yeah, we did talk about that. Why would there be a need for a second enlightenment? Because capitalism mystified things again. In other words, the transparency of bourgeois society became opaque in the 19th century. And that's where we get this word from Marx of phantasmagorical character of commodity fetishism. So we need to understand the opacity. We can't just dispel it. Right? So he's going to get to Trotsky, but the reason for this is because unlike with the bourgeois revolution, which took hundreds of years and was a gradual transformation of society, that the Enlightenment comes at the end of that process. Meaning, why could the Enlightenment think of itself as dispelling all the old superstitions? Because in practice they had already been dispelled. That Marxism sees the proletarian socialist revolution as the exact opposite of that, which is that the revolution comes at the beginning, not at the end of the process, which means that the revolution happens in a state of mystification. It happens within an ideological mystification. And that's socialism. Right, so I mentioned that Marx is the critic of German philosophy, French socialism, and British political economy. Why? Because they've all become ideological. They've all gone from being enlightening to being mystifying. So Hegel was enlightening. But in capitalism, to be a Hegelian would be to mystify things. The British political economy was enlightening. Adam Smith was enlightening. But to remain a Smithian in capitalism would be mystifying. It would conceal more than it would reveal. Okay. So that's why we need to perceive the everyday world that we take for granted as opaque, but also that opacity is quotidian. It's the prosaic reality that we're living in. The most passionate investigation of telepathic phenomena, for example, is what the Surrealists did. They sat around wondering whether they could read each other's minds through various exquisite corpse exercises. Will not teach us half as much about reading, which is an eminently telepathic process, as the profane illumination of reading about telepathic phenomena. And the most passionate investigation of the Hashish trance will not teach us half as much as thinking, which is eminently narcotic, as the profane illumination of thinking about the Hashish trance.
It's like a tongue twister. I don't understand what he's saying.
All right, so what he's saying is that it's not the Hashish trance, but trying to think about it that is illuminating. It's not the telepathic phenomenon, but writing about the telepathic phenomenon that is actually enlightening. The reader, the thinker, the loiterer, the flaneur are types of Illuminati, just as much as the opium eater, the dreamer, and the ecstatic, and more profane. Not to mention that most terrible drug, ourselves, which we take in solitude. Right, so that's why I've always been a little bit of a teetotaler. It's like, okay, I don't really need to take any drugs. I'm already pretty tweaked up, pretty freaked out by myself. It's fine. I don't need any of that. I can do that myself. And of course, it's more terrifying. To win the energies of intoxication for the revolution, in other words, poetic politics. We have tried that beverage, anything rather than that. While it will interest you all the more how much an excursion into poetry clarifies things. For what is the program of the bourgeois parties? A bad poem on springtime, filled to bursting with metaphors. I told you guys that the Trump campaign used Les Mis. Can you hear the people singing? The socialist sees that, quote, finer future of our children and grandchildren in a condition in which all act as if they were angels, and everyone has as much as if he were rich, and everyone lives as if he were free. Of angels, wealth, freedom, not a trace. These are mere images. And the stock imagery of these poets of the Social Democratic Associations, their gradus ad parnassum, optimism. A very different error is breathed in the Neville essay that makes the organization of pessimism the call of the hour. Actually, Nietzsche also has an expression in The Birth of Tragedy. He says, what would be the pessimism of the strong? Not the pessimism of the weak, but the pessimism of the strong. In the name of his literary friends, he delivers an ultimatum in face of which this unprincipled dilettantish optimism must unfailingly show its true colors. Where are the conditions for revolution? In the changing of attitudes or of external circumstances? Of course, not in the changing of attitudes. That is the cardinal question that determines the relation of politics to morality and cannot be glossed over. Surrealism has come ever closer to the communist answer, and that means pessimism all along the line. Absolutely. Mistrust in the fate of literature, mistrust in the fate of freedom, mistrust in the fate of European humanity, but 3 times mistrust in all reconciliation between classes, between nations, between individuals, and unlimited trust only in E.E. Farben and the peaceful perfection of the Air Force. But now, what next? Or what now, what next? Let me jump ahead here. If it is the double task of the revolutionary intelligentsia to overthrow the intellectual predominance of the bourgeoisie and to make contact with the proletarian masses, the intelligentsia has failed almost entirely in the second part of this task, because it can no longer be performed contemplatively. And yet this has hindered hardly anybody from approaching it again and again as if it could, and calling for proletarian poets, thinkers, and artists. To counter this, Trotsky had to point out, as early as Literature and Revolution, that's in 1923, that such artists would only emerge from a victorious revolution. In reality, it is far less a matter of making the artist of bourgeois origin into a master of proletarian art than of deploying him, even at the expense of his artistic activity, at important points in the sphere of imagery. Indeed, might not perhaps the interruption of his artistic career be an essential part of his new function? So I mentioned the author as producer. He takes this argument further in the author as producer and in some ways complicates it. The jokes he tells are the better for it, and he tells them better. For in the joke too, in invective, in misunderstanding, in all cases where an action puts forth its own image, and exists absorbing and consuming it, where nearness looks with its own eyes, the long-sought image sphere is open, the world of universal and integral actualities, where the best room is missing. The sphere, in a word, in which political materialism and physical nature share the inner man, the psyche, the individual, or whatever else we may wish to throw at them, with dialectical justice, so that no limb remains unrent. Nevertheless, indeed precisely after such dialectical annihilation, this will still be a sphere of images, and more concretely of bodies. For it must in the end be admitted, metaphysical materialism, of the brand of evoked and Bukharin, as is attested by the experience of the Surrealists, and earlier of Hegel, Gerhard Buchner, Nietzsche, and Rimbaud, cannot lead without rupture to anthropological materialism. There is a residue. And so what is he talking about there? Metaphysical materialism versus anthropological materialism. So he thinks that evoked and Bukharin, by the way, is the big theorist of the Bolsheviks. And Lenin on his deathbed said, Bukharin's not really a Marxist, he's not dialectical enough. Yes. And Benjamin's aware of that, of course. And Vogt is was a socialist ideologue that Marx wrote a whole book about against him. Anyway, Georg Büchner is earlier. He's a kind of early 19th century figure, and we know Nietzsche and Robo. Now leave without interruption to anthropological materialism. So anthropological materialism would be, again, not presuming any a priori materialism, but finding it only in what humans actually do. He says there's a residue. The collective is a body too, and the phusis that is being organized for it in technology can, through all its political and factual reality, only be produced in that image sphere to which profane illumination initiates us. Only when in technology, body and image so interpenetrate that all revolutionary tension becomes bodily collective innervation, and all the bodily innervations of the collective become revolutionary discharge, has reality transcended itself to the extent demanded by the Communist Manifesto. For the moment, only the Surrealists have understood its present commands. They exchange to a man the play of human features for the face of an alarm clock that in each minute rings for 60 seconds. What? Okay. I jumped ahead to that because I actually think it helps us track back to some of the things that he writes about in the body of the essay. So remember that the most surrealist image is the city itself, right? And that gets us back to things that we talked about with the Berlin Chronicle, the spatialization of time. So a clock is a way of spatializing time, right? So the hands of the clock are moving through space, and that's how we're telling time. So, so action becoming an image, so that's like action freezing into an image, but then the image is set back into motion. And that's the dialectical image of the profane illumination. So the human features become a clock which is moving, but is also not moving because it's constantly ringing the alarm, right? So it's like, and who knows whether this works or not? Let's just Benjamin's like a brilliant guy, whatever. But you know, does he get his ideas across? How well does he get his ideas across? You know, when he's doing his own little surrealisty things, like, how does that work again? Is that working? Right? Kind of, but it's hard. And instead, people have just sort of projected whatever they want Benjamin to mean on it. So technology, when in technology, body and image so interpenetrate that all revolutionary tension becomes bodily collective innervation, and all bodily innervations of the collective become revolutionary discharge. So that can just sound like Bergson. That can just simply sound like what Bergson is criticized for being like vitalism, meaning, you know, where the body is an image and images are just circuits of action. So how is that not the case? Because in fact, that's where Benjamin thinks Surrealism is doing this critical reification. Meaning by turning actions into images and by trying to make images explosive, to use the language of Bertrand last week, right, the convulsive beauty. What you're dealing with is the contradiction between reification and revolutionary action and the inseparability of these things. Right, so you're trying to take a frozen reality and set it into motion, or you're trying to take a moving reality and freeze it. Okay, so why is that important? Because this is capitalism. Capitalism is both the congealing of human labor and the dead labor that moves, to use Marx's language from Das Kapital. So it's both human labor becoming a thing, and it's things that act instead of humans. Right, so again, what the Surrealists are doing is capitalism. However, it allows us to see it. And by seeing it, we also see how socialist revolution is also capitalism. Where it's the task, but it's also made possible by it. The task to overcome capitalism that's also made possible by it. So again, that would be where he sees the opposition of spontaneity against discipline. He sees it as just the obverse side of what's necessary. Meaning, of course, capitalist discipline is what's causing us to anarchically revolt against it. But in fact, that's not going to be enough. Right? And yes, the anarchists are right to say that Marxism just adopts the discipline of capitalism in the name of revolution. But that's the only way we're going to overcome capitalism, in fact. Right? So, he's doing maybe a more straightforwardly Marxist treatment than we might appreciate through all these fireworks, which is to say, the Surrealists in their anarchism are more collusive with capitalism than they think. Of course, the Stalinists would say that. So then what's the next step? The next step is to say, yes, but in doing that, they are actually allowing us to grasp how capitalism functions in the subjective sphere of images and experience, rather than ending up with a kind of position on it that is outside of it. Right, so the fact that they're enacting it means that that is what gives their work a critical importance. So he's turning the charge of decadence against the kind of socialist, realist, or Stalinist. And the invocation of Trotsky is important. So I don't know if we talked about this before, but so in Literature and Revolution, Trotsky wrote a book weighing in on debates in the early Soviet Union where different radical art movements were claiming the right to state funding and support, and claiming that they were the real proletarian art, the real revolutionary art, the real socialist art, as opposed to the other movements. And so Trotsky basically says, so he has a chapter that says, what is proletarian art and is it possible? And what he says is, it's not possible. That basically, when workers become artists, they become bourgeois artists because that's the only art that we have. It's a very straightforwardly Marx idea, which is that the revolution is still bourgeois society, it's done in the name of bourgeois right, and it inherits all the problems of capitalism. So what Trotsky said is, these are capitalist phenomena, these are like modernist avant-garde movements that predate the revolution, they're attaching themselves to the revolution. That's fine, but we can't endorse any of their practices as somehow inherently proletarian or working class or socialistic. So he advocates a laissez-faire attitude. So basically he says the state should support all of them without giving preference. As long as they're not actively propagandizing against the revolution, it's fine. And again, even that's like a kind of a qualified thing. It's 1923, so it's early after the Civil War yet. And what he says is that bourgeois culture developed under feudalism, but there is no socialist culture that's developing under capitalism. It's just capitalism. And the proletariat is just the negative principle of capitalism, meaning socialism is not equivalent to the culture of the proletariat. No, the culture of the proletariat is just the culture of capitalism. So that's like super important, this invocation. And he's writing this a year after Trotsky is expelled from the Soviet Union. So this is 1929. Trotsky is expelled from the Soviet Union in 1928. So it's registering a dissent from the prevailing Stalinism. This is around the time also that he traveled to the Soviet Union. and wrote his Moscow diary where he expressed his disenchantment with the Soviet Union. With what was going on in the Soviet Union. But anyway, okay, so the Surrealists, the fact that they are just modernists, that they're just part of the avant-garde that exists under capitalism, that's not to dismiss them at all. It's the truth of what they're doing. So the only question is a dialectical understanding of the truth of what they're doing, rather than a kind of partisan endorsement or condemnation of it. Now, I mentioned that this idea, he actually, in 1934, that's when the author is producer is written, he complicates this because here he seems to be going along with something that he later criticizes, which is that the artist should just be a saboteur in the enemy camp. Right, because he is not even seeing the Surrealists that way here. And again, if we pay attention to the way he narrates the history, he's saying things like, he's saying rather wicked things, which is that, the anarchists are responsible for World War I, meaning like whatever nihilistic, because that's what the anarchists were called. They were called the nihilists by the powers that be. But also, does Dostoevsky use that language? I think Dostoevsky uses the language of the nihilism, yeah. And there's some self-description also as nihilists, even though it's kind of a pejorative term. And Benjamin's point, we read the Experience in Poverty essay, is that whatever nihilistic blowing up of the bourgeois world the anarchists wanted, they got much more than they bargained for in World War I. Meaning capitalism blows up the bourgeois world enough. It's not like revolutionaries have to blow up the bourgeois world. No, capitalism does that just fine and beyond anything that any revolutionary conspiracy can aspire to do. So that's just not the way. It's not the way to put it in terms of the Mandalorian. This is the way. You guys know this one? Star Wars. This is the way, this is not the way. Phusis. We've encountered that word before, we're going to encounter it again with Nietzsche. We encountered it in to the planetarium aphorism from One Way Street. Phusis means nature, like the nature of the thing in itself, as opposed to everything being a way to something else. So it's the phusis is the opposite of the Tao, or the way. So treating everything in the world as having a nature in itself, as opposed to treating everything in the world as just a vehicle for the divine forces. Again, the critical reification. The fetishism of commodities. Right. What's revolutionary about the fetishism of commodities? So again, completely different from the way these things are usually understood, because Marxism is seen as like against commodity fetishism. The whole point is socialism is to oppose commodity. No. Point is, how are we going to transform capitalism in and through commodity fetishism? Right, so that's why Baudelaire and the Surrealists become important, because they're exemplifying this. And also, they're not really, Baudelaire is producing poetry, but when we read about Baudelaire, the paradox of writing lyric poetry in a world that completely negates lyric poetry. Here, the question is, are the Surrealists even producing artworks? They're not really, right? So what are they producing? That's why they seem to be producing methods, but those methods are really just tricks. meaning they're just a change in optics. And I think that he uses the term dialectical optics. This is the dialectical image, the profane illumination. So they're doing exercises in profane illumination more than they're producing works. They're not really producing works. And yet, even though they're resisting commodification thereby, because the 20th century avant-garde is all about that, like Dada and Surrealism, and then postmodernism has tried to continue this tradition of not producing works because a work is commodifiable. So instead you produce situations, you produce like effects, you produce like methods to try to resist commodification. That's capitalism. That is capitalism. The dematerialization of labor, that's capitalism. It's in the Communist Manifesto. All that is solid melts into air. All the stuff that's resistant to commodification is capitalism. So again, not to sort of one-sidedly endorse it, but to recognize it as part of capitalism and to try to find the critical value of that. Now here's the difference with Romanticism. Romanticism was still trying to produce works, but those works had a paradoxical quality, which is that Romanticism produced artworks that were about the impossibility of producing artworks. So it's poetry about the impossibility of poetry, music about the impossibility of music, so everything is like suggestive and pointing beyond the form to something else. It's why he lines it up with the occult, what he calls the occult, and why it's the opposite of revealed religion. So revealed religion, it would be that, again, you can manifest the divine. Well, what if you make images that are about the impossibility of manifesting the divine, as opposed to imagery that manifests the divine? Right, so Romanticism reaches back to the Middle Ages, it reaches back to classical antiquity in order to produce images that like pay homage to that time when the divine could be revealed, but then the Romantic work is about how we can't do that. We can just sort of be nostalgic for or point to the absence of the revelation of the divine. And that's how modernism is generated out of Romanticism, because, and again, paradoxically, which is to say that what is Baudelaire doing? Is he trying to manifest the divine? Is he saying, no, actually we can, but it's a different divine. It's the divine of the evil of modernity, right? It's the Gnostical demon, it's Satan, it's whatever, right? We can manifest the divine, it's all around us, right? God's will is all around us. It turns out that God's will is evil. All right. And the kind of necessary transformation of that, even if trying to continue it with the Surrealists. Meaning, again, Baudelaire was writing poetry. The Surrealists are not. I say all this only because the postmodernists try to turn Dada and Surrealism simply into the anti-aesthetic. And in so doing, they're trying to dispel a kind of romantic modernism in favor of something more radical and more transgressive. But Benjamin's here to say it's still capitalism. Finally, one last thing I'll say. So this is another a Lenin anecdote. So I mentioned Lenin saying that Bukharin is an undialectical materialist and therefore not a Marxist. The other Lenin anecdote, which I think we've talked about, have we talked about? He went to a Dada play or a Dada performance, and when he was in exile in Switzerland, in Zurich, he lived down the street from this place where the Dadaists were. And anyway, then he was asked after watching the performance, was that revolutionary enough? And Lenin said, nothing, we're never revolutionary enough. One can never be too revolutionary. The reason being capitalism is more revolutionary than we could ever be. And he said the task is to be as radical as reality itself. And of course, that's what the Surrealists were trying to do. That's what Surrealism means. It's not something other than reality. It's an attempt to be as radical as reality itself. So the only question is, how? Because the surrealists could legitimately claim that all art is surrealist. That all art has always ever been surrealist, meaning all art has aspired to be as radical as reality itself. And of course, that's inseparable from religion, from religious intoxication. But now we have to do it as a function of, or religious revelation, now we have to do it as a function of profane illumination. Meaning as radical as reality itself, but the reality of capitalism, not the reality of God's will. All right, so next week, Thanksgiving. The week after that, I'll send an announcement reminding you we will meet during Critique Week, and we'll talk about Nietzsche and the other writings on the syllabus that are not the Paris exposés. And Convolute. Convolute D, look at Convolute D. Convolute D will be useful for the Nietzsche. Any volunteers for that, by the way? Anyone want to volunteer for notes? I know it's Critique Week, so it's optional, so I'm not like forcing it. But anyone interested in taking on Nietzsche? Okay, that's one. We have our one engagement directly with Nietzsche in the course, so hopefully it will be sufficient. All right. Thanks, guys.